Good evening, I'm Joseph Dobrian, back on the airwaves again after a brief hiatus with a new show, simply called The Joseph Dobrian Show. And I'm going to kick it off with a two-part show, half hour now, half hour next week, in which I promote my new novel. My new novel is called Hardwired, and it is out now officially. You can get it on Amazon.com. You can get it at Prairie Lights Books. You can order it from my website, josephdobrian.com. You can order it from my publisher's website, which is rex-imperator.com. So just no excuse for not buying and reading my new novel, Hardwired. And on this show, I'm going to talk a little about it, and then I'm going to read some of it to whet your appetite a little bit. Now, I don't know whether you read my most recent novel, Ambitions, which was published in 2014, but if you did, or if you saw the front cover, you'll remember the picture of the bald-headed man kind of looking over his shoulder at a bunch of people behind him. That is Andy Palinkas. Andy Palinkas is an older man who lives in a town called State City, Iowa, and he's a businessman there. That book that I published a couple of years ago, Ambitions, he was the narrator of the story. He wasn't the main character, but he told the story about a neighbor family of his that he found kind of interesting and kind of horrifying. And that was Ambitions, the story of that family told by Andy Palinkas. Well, now this new novel is called Hardwired, and this is going to be Andy Palinkas telling his own story. This book visits Andy as a teenager, growing up in State City, Iowa, in the early and mid-1960s. Now, the novelist Kurt Vonnegut is famous for one piece of really, really good advice about writing good fiction. Many writers consider it the most important piece of advice of all if you're writing fiction. At any rate, they place it in the top 5 tips for good fiction writing. And Vonnegut said, make your character want something right away, even if it's only a glass of water. Characters paralyzed by the meaninglessness of modern life still have to drink water from time to time. Now, usually when I write a novel, I will put it through 1 or 2 drafts before I have an idea of what each of my characters wants. It's then that I'm able, once I've figured that out, then I'm able to turn it from a mere narrative of events into an actual story. And at that point, if somebody asks me, what's your novel about, I'll be able to give them the 15-second answer. But I still might not at that point be able to answer the question, what kind of a novel is it? Usually when somebody asks you what kind of a novel is it, whether they know it or not, they are asking what one of the basic plots are you using? Now, you might be writing genre fiction. You might be writing, for example, a romance novel, or a detective novel, or a cowboy novel. Those all follow pretty much the same plot. But literary fiction also has just a very few basic plots that get used over and over again, and have been used over and over again for thousands of years. Now, it wasn't until I had put Hardwired through 8 or 9 drafts out of the 15 that I ended up writing that I realized that the old saying that there are only 7 basic plots of fiction might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but not by much. We really do tell the same stories over and over again. And it dawned on me a few months ago as I was putting this book through one of the later drafts that I was writing a modern version of Miguel de Cervantes' novel, Don Quixote. Don Quixote was probably the first really respectable novel. There had been novels written before that one, but that was the first one that really caught on internationally and became a famous and respectable book. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, my book really is the Don Quixote story retold for a modern audience. The protagonist of this book is Andy Palinkas. He's a teenager in the early to mid-1960s. He is a fat, unattractive, unmotivated adolescent boy. And ever since his earliest childhood, he has been the kid that all the other kids pick on. You know, he's the very, very lowest in the pecking order. We've all seen that. If we haven't been that kid, we've seen that kid. And so, of course, he feels very resentful of his schoolmates. He also harbors various resentments towards his parents. So he just does his best to isolate himself from the rest of society. During his preteen years, he pretty much loses himself in books. Now, as a teenager, Andy has a kind of a hostile and dislikable personality. He's suspicious of just about everybody he meets because he knows that they could turn on him and betray him at any moment. So he nurses grievances against just about anybody. Sometimes he has to admit to himself that they are petty, stupid grievances. But he has them anyway, and he harbors all of these idle thoughts that he knows perfectly well are mean-spirited. He also develops an obsessive crush on a girl that he knows perfectly well that he can't win. He embarrasses himself at sports. He's a horrible athlete. Plus, as Andy observes in the book, having a younger brother who can beat you at anything, that has got to be the worst thing in the world. So Andy has to cope with this pathological self-loathing that he has by imagining himself as a hero. He will create alternative realities in which he's powerful, accomplished, brave, and sometimes scenarios where he is vengeful. He tells the reader early in the book, all I ever wanted out of childhood was out of childhood. As he tries to hurry up his growing up process as best he can, Andy remarks on the history that's being made all around him, because he is aware, even as he's living it, that the 60s were a fascinating time to be alive, fascinating time to be growing up. And he mentions the assassination of President Kennedy, the civil rights movement, the growing awareness of the Vietnam War. And as Andy observes all of this history being made around him, he starts to develop a political conscience and his own strong sense of justice. Now, Don Quixote was crazy. He was delusional. Andy is not delusional. He is aware that he's building castles in the air, and he's doing this to escape a reality that he hates. And when he adopts one cause or project or another, he will usually know in advance that it's futile, that he's just wasting his time, embarrassing himself. But even if Andy is neurotic, and even if he knows he's neurotic, he's also totally sane. He's maybe a little bit too sane for his own good. But he's occasionally bright enough that he's able to use his personal quirks to his advantage. Now, some of the characters, the other characters that appear in Don Quixote, also appear in a way in Hardwired. For example, Don Quixote has a sidekick named Sancho Panza. Andy also has a sidekick, a very loyal, not too bright, but commonsensical kid named Arno Prick. And like Don Quixote, Andy Palinkas has a Dulcinea, a woman he idolizes. That would be Grace Childress, who is an almost perfect girl, slightly older than Andy, and Andy is forever trying to impress her, somewhat to the amusement and sometimes to the dismay of Grace's younger and plainer sister, Charity. Now, Andy also has a somewhat contentious relationship with a kid named Mitch Rosen, who's sort of the class go-getter, the big man on campus, the The student government type, you all know that type. Well, he also encounters several teachers who are archetypes with which you too are probably familiar. For example, there's the French teacher who can just barely speak the language. There's the boys' gym teacher who uses intimidation as a teaching tool. There's the drama coach who's very enthusiastic, very dedicated to her work, but really kind of snobbish about it. And then you've got a subplot in this book which explores the rather difficult, rather unbalanced friendship between Andy's mother, who is very kind-hearted but very depressive, and the mother of Grace Childress, who is very domineering, very over-assertive. Now, as the book goes on, you'll discover that his schoolmates might not all like Andy very much, but they can't help finding him interesting. They can't help noticing him. And they notice that he's an interesting guy, whether or not he's likable. So to his amazement, by his senior year, he has actually become one of the cool kids, or almost one of the cool kids anyway. And then he faces a big decision that might cost him the status and the admiration that he's earned. The questions that confront him are, do you own yourself, or are you the property of your community? And do you, just by virtue of your existence, do you owe anything to your community? Now, Andy very loudly and very publicly asserts, I don't owe the community the warm steam off my pee. But the question is he going to stick to that opinion for the rest of the book, or is he going to change? Is he going to stick to his principles, or is he going to change his principles? You'll find out. Now, this book, Hardwired, is going to resonate with any adult who remembers the endless humiliations, the painful humor, and the occasional victories of adolescence. The title of the book comes from Andy's belief that his personality is what it is, and it can't be changed, that he is hardwired from birth, so to speak, and that therefore it's possible that he never really had any control over the outcome of his life. Now, whether or not that's true, Andy does have a very strong sense of personal responsibility all throughout the book, and perhaps he has a conscience that's a little bit too active. It's clear that he regards his own personality as his toughest challenge in life. He also has a quest, just as Don Quixote had a quest. In Andy's case, the quest is simply to fight his way through childhood and adolescence and reach a man's estate, to finally become, in as much as any man can, become his own master. So with that, I'm going to read you some of this book for the rest of this show and for most of the next show. And I'm just going to start at the very beginning, and then maybe I'll skip ahead here and there, but I'll read you the first chapter anyway. Book 1, Chapter 1 is called My Wiring. This is a story about my dick and balls. I could say that this is my memoir about getting through, but maybe it's also about getting to. A quest, I say, self-importantly, for personal redemption. Imagine a self-satisfied little chin lift there. But in the final analysis, this is a story about my dick and balls. Let's begin with a nightmare I had many years before I wrote all of this down. My family was still living in Waukesha, Wisconsin. This would have been 1959, 3 years before we moved to Iowa. I was 11 years old in the 6th grade, old enough that the boys and the girls no longer took phys ed together, but not old enough that we had to change into gym clothes. The girls were over on the other end of the school gym doing whatever their instructor had them doing, and we boys were sitting cross-legged on the floor of our side of the gym with our instructor, Mr. Marzetti, facing us. He was big, slightly flabby, with a dark complexion, black crew cut, and a heavy 5 o'clock shadow even though it was morning. Someone had brought a big wooden block, maybe 30 inches high, into the gym. Mr. Marzetti was standing next to it. He addressed us. His words were indistinct. I couldn't hear all of it because it was a dream, but the sense of it was clear. Because of a new school rule, each of us boys was to have his dick and balls cut off. Mr. Marzetti instructed us to line up next to the wooden block and be prepared to drop our pants when our turn came. We saw now that he had a meat axe in his hand. The boys, incredibly, fell into line. Nobody protested. Nobody even hesitated to comply. I can't remember who was first, but it was a classmate of mine in real life, a kid I knew. He stepped up to the block and laid his dick and balls on the surface. Mr. Marzetti took one sharp downward swing with the meat axe, severed them, and then swept them onto the floor with the edge of the blade. The boy staggered away, clutching at his crotch, and the next boy stood up to the block and placed his junk there with the same result. I was lagging behind, not quite getting into line. I think nobody noticed me. People generally didn't notice me much in gym class because they all knew that I was the fat, slow kid who cried and couldn't do even the easiest stuff. It was the third kid's turn when I decided I had better get out of there. A door over on the girls' side of the gym led outside to the school playground. Out of the corner of my eye, as I started to dash for the door, or rather as I waddled to the door as best speed I could manage, which wasn't much, I saw the fourth boy, a kid I had always been pretty friendly with, stepping up to the block. He was the shortest boy in the class, so he had to stand up on his tiptoes to get his junk up onto the block. But he was doing his best to comply, and down came the meat axe again. Mr. Marzetti was focused on his task and didn't notice me leaving. None of the girls, who seemed oblivious to what was happening to the boys, tried to stop me. None of the boys called attention to my departure. I glanced back for an instant as I went through the door. 4 of the boys now were lying on the floor, moaning and clutching at themselves. I could see the back of boy 5 as he stood up to the block, and Mr. Marzetti swung the cleaver down. The rest waited their turn. The floor around the chopping block was slick with blood and scraps. I was outside. The playground was deserted. I ran inasmuch as a fat little boy with deformed feet could run. Through the playground to the street, running. I wasn't sure where to. The next thing I recall, I had gone several miles, running all the way. An incredible accomplishment considering my age and condition. I was utterly winded, utterly exhausted, but I had to keep running. I was in a neighborhood of Waukesha that consisted mostly of older, bigger, fancier homes. Somehow I knew that I was near a house where a lawyer lived, and I knew that the lawyer would be at home. I staggered up the front walk and up the front steps of a big white colonial house. I pounded on the front door, and then I let myself in. The lawyer was a white-haired man in his 60s. I didn't know him. I'd never seen him before. I just knew that he would be in that house and that he was a lawyer. He was fairly tall and heavy. He had thick hair and a big white mustache and a red face. He wore a dark 3-piece suit with a watch chain across his waistcoat. Again, I don't usually remember dialogue in dreams, or if I do, it's only a little of it. But I remember telling the lawyer why I was there, what was happening at my school, and how I had managed to escape and had run all the way to his house. The lawyer listened to me, sitting stock still in a big overstuffed swivel chair at his desk. This was in his home office we were in, and I don't recall how I got into that room once I had barged into his house. And he was nodding, looking thoughtful, not saying anything while I babbled out my account. Then finally, when I ran down, he said something. I didn't catch it all, but I heard the word injunction. It's surprising that I knew what an injunction was at that age, but I did. He said injunction. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number and said something. By this time, I was half sitting, half lying on the floor of his office. It had a thick, soft, olive green carpeting. And when he hung up the phone, he turned to me, looked kindly at me, and he said, "It'll be okay. We'll get an injunction. You won't have to have it done to you." I remember hearing that clearly. I felt such relief and such gratitude to that old man, and God forgive me, such glee that I was going to be the only boy in the school who had gotten to keep his junk. Then I woke up, gasping, terrified. I lay there in my bed, only slowly realizing that it had been a dream. Even after I had convinced myself of that, it was a while before I could fall back to sleep. Here I am in my old age, or getting near to it anyway. I turned 69 in the spring of 2017, and I still torture myself with memories of what a rotten child I was. I even remember and condemn myself for evil thoughts that I never voiced, never acted upon. A person sometimes has an urge to do something truly horrid. Probably most of us have had private thoughts that the devil and all his imps would be ashamed of. But if you have those thoughts, those evil impulses, you usually fight back the urge to act on them. You don't do whatever you were thinking about doing because you're not crazy enough or wicked enough to do it, right? Most people have those moments, I suppose. But I have had an awful lot of them. I can still remember times when I was a little boy when I only thought to do something unkind or downright horrible, when I only thought about it and didn't do it. But I'll still recollect even those impulses that I never acted upon. I'll brood about them, and I'll remind myself that they are proof of what a bad person I am. It's a pathological thing, I guess, my obsessing about what a louse I've been all my life. I'm no expert in human psychology, so I can't know this for sure. But I can't imagine that normal people constantly remind themselves of all the bad things they have ever done, all of their words or deeds that were mean or inconsiderate or tactless or just plain crazy. Oh, sure, I'm willing to believe that we all sometimes look back and think something like, I was a bit of a bully as a kid, or I wish I had been more considerate of my family, or I wish I had worked harder. I'm sure nobody has gone through life without regrets. But maybe I take it to an extreme. Almost invariably, almost every day of my life, my first thought on awakening, and I mean literally my first thought when I open my eyes and roll over in bed, is a memory of one shameful thing or another that I did way long ago, usually in my childhood. I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating. I'll remember a time when I accidentally insulted someone or was intentionally cruel or petty or vindictive, or I might remember a petty or vindictive thought that I never acted upon. That will be my wake-up message to myself, and almost every morning, as I sit up in bed, I will say out loud, I hate you. I have a daily ritual that I can't force myself to not go through. I will look myself in the eye in the mirror as I shave, and I will say, you suck, Andrew Palinkas. You suck. God, you make me ill, you worthless piece of garbage. Or words to that effect. Whatever I am now, whatever I have made of myself, whatever place I have put myself in, whether it's good or bad, whether it's enviable or not, I put myself there. It might be easier if I could blame my disappointments or regrets on other people, like my parents or my teachers or the kids I had to deal with when I was growing up, or society in general. The conventional wisdom is that your parents screw you up as they bring you up. Whatever neuroses you have were instilled in you by your parents. But I believe that that is only partly true. You're not a blank slate at birth. Other people do to you what they do to you, and in some cases, I suppose, if a person ends up unhappy, it might not be his fault. I'm sure there are innocent victims, people who got totally messed up by other people, or by circumstances beyond their control. I'm not one of those. That's all I'm saying. If I had to point to the one time in my life when I felt best about myself, that is, proud to have done something right for a change, I would have to point to a sequence of events that took place in my last year of high school, 1965 to 66, when I was 17 to 18. But one thing I did during that time was something that my parents, my mother anyway, might say was the worst offense that I ever committed. If my life has had a crowning achievement, that might have been it. When I was a teenager, I used to roll my eyes when an older person would tell me, these are the best years of your life. But as it turned out, in some ways, they were. Not in the sense that they were the happiest years of my life. They certainly weren't. But they were perhaps the years in which my career as a bad person reached its zenith. I'll tell you later on about that one awful, awful thing that I did back then, after I've told you about all the other awful, awful things that I did prior to that. Okay, I'm kidding. I'm kidding in a sense. Ever since high school, I've only been moderately awful. I have no criminal record. I've had a career. I have no debts. I have a nice house and a nice car. I'm a Rotarian. I'm getting ready to retire and pretty well off at that. You could say I'm living the dream, even if it's a solitary dream. I never got married. I never started a family. That, too, has been my choice, no matter how hard I may try to pretend otherwise. My parents died, both of them, in 2005, within a few months of each other. They were both in their 80s and still living in that same house in State City, Iowa that we had moved into when I was 14 in 1962. Mom contracted a form of Alzheimer's that progressed quickly and killed her in about 2 years. Shortly after that, Dad basically stopped trying to live, and he caught a case of bronchial pneumonia at the start of one of those brutal Iowa winters at the end of that year, and that took him off. And some weeks after Dad died, as I was going through the boxes and boxes of papers and pictures in my parents' apartment, I found a few documents that went back to my preschool years, my elementary school years, my high school years. And one of them, the earliest document that they had of me, I think, was an evaluation that Mom and Dad had kept of me when I was 4 years old, written by Winifred Winkie, the supervisor of the Waukesha Montessori preschool. I have got a phenomenal memory. My brother Mark, who is certainly brighter and more successful than I am, will sometimes call or email me to see if I remember the details of some bit of family history that he has forgotten. I bet I can recall the substance, if not every single word, of every conversation I've ever had with anyone. Sure, you might say that's impossible. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm exaggerating. But if I am, it's not by much. If I want to recall it to mind, I can. Any conversation, any interaction. I have too good of a memory. My life might have been so much more pleasant if I had been able to forget more of it. I have to admit, I had put out of my mind most of the behavior and the incidents to which Mrs. Winkie referred in this evaluation. But as I read it, it all came back to me, and way too clearly at that, which makes me wonder, can I say I remember everything, but how much might I have forgotten? And that, I think, is a good place to break off the first of these 2 episodes in which I am reading from my new novel, Hardwired. Tune in next week to find out what Mrs. Winkie wrote about Andrew Palinkas. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Good night.